On the night of October 12, 1895, the Whitmore family gathered in their mansion overlooking Grafton County, Virginia, to celebrate what they believed would be their greatest triumph. By dawn, 23 people would be dead, the county's only bank would collapse, and an entire community of over 4,000 souls would find themselves plunged into a catastrophe so complete that some families would never recover. This is not a ghost story. This is not a tale of curses whispered in the dark. This is the true account of how greed, pride, and one family's ruthless ambition destroyed everything they touched in a single terrible night. Grafton County sat nestled in the rolling hills of southwestern Virginia, a patchwork of tobacco farms, timber operations, and small mining ventures that had brought modest prosperity to its residents since before the Civil War. The county seat, Haverford, was a town of roughly 1,200 people, with a main street lined with brick storefronts, a courthouse built in 1842, and the Grafton County Bank, a 3-story limestone building that had stood since 1868. The bank was more than just a financial institution. It was the beating heart of the community, holding the savings of farmers, the operating capital of merchants, and the mortgage papers of nearly every property owner in the county. The Whitmore family had arrived in Grafton County in 1879, when patriarch Samuel Whitmore purchased a struggling textile mill on the outskirts of Haverford for a fraction of its worth. Samuel was a man of 42 at the time, tall and broad-shouldered, with steel-grey eyes that rarely blinked and a smile that never quite reached those eyes. He had made his fortune in railroad speculation up north, though rumors whispered that he'd left Pennsylvania one step ahead of federal investigators, looking into questionable land deals. Within 5 years of his arrival, Samuel had transformed the failing mill into the county's largest employer, bringing in modern machinery and securing contracts to supply uniforms to military installations across the South. But Samuel Whitmore was never a man satisfied with mere success. He wanted control. By 1885, he had secured a position on the board of directors at Grafton County Bank. By 1889, he had maneuvered his oldest son, Thomas, into the role of bank president after the previous president suffered a convenient riding accident that left him unable to work. By 1893, the Whitmore family effectively controlled every major financial decision in the county. They decided who received loans and who was denied. They determined which businesses expanded and which shuttered their doors. They held the economic fate of thousands in their hands, and they wielded that power without mercy. Thomas Whitmore was 34 years old in 1895, cut from the same cloth as his father, but with an added edge of cruelty that Samuel had learned to mask. Thomas enjoyed foreclosing on struggling farmers, took pleasure in denying credit to merchants who had crossed him, and maintained a network of informants who reported on anyone who spoke against the Whitmore family. His younger brother, William, served as the mill's operations manager, a position that allowed him to set wages and working conditions with absolute authority. Their sister, Catherine, had married the county sheriff, ensuring that law enforcement turned a blind eye to any complaints against the family. The Whitmore mansion sat on a hill 2 miles outside Haverford, a sprawling 3-story structure with white columns and wide verandas that offered commanding views of the valley below. The house had been built with money that should have gone to modernizing the mill's safety equipment, but Samuel had prioritized his family's comfort over his workers' welfare. Inside those walls, crystal chandeliers hung from painted ceilings, Persian rugs covered polished floors, and servants moved silently through rooms filled with furniture imported from Europe. On that October evening, the family had gathered to celebrate what they believed would be their final victory. For months, Samuel and Thomas had been quietly buying up land options throughout the county, using intermediaries and shell companies to disguise their involvement. They had learned that the Chesapeake and Western Railroad was planning a new line through the region, and they intended to own every acre of land the railroad would need. Once the railroad announced its route, the Whitmore family would sell their holdings at 10 times what they'd paid, making a fortune that would establish them among Virginia's wealthiest families for generations. But their plan had one fatal flaw. To finance the land purchases, Thomas had systematically embezzled funds from the Grafton County Bank, hiding the missing money through false ledger entries and phantom loans. He had convinced himself that once the land sales went through, he could replace the money before anyone noticed. He was wrong. And on that October night, as the Whitmores raised their glasses in celebration, forces were already in motion that would bring their world crashing down around them. The first sign of trouble came at 6:45 that evening, when a telegram arrived at the Haverford train station addressed to Bank Director Harold Prescott. The station master, a thin man named George Bentley, recognized the urgency marking on the envelope and immediately saddled his horse to deliver it to Prescott's home on Maple Street. The telegram came from the Virginia State Banking Commission in Richmond, and its message was brief but devastating. Federal banking examiners would arrive in Haverford on the morning of October 14th to conduct an unannounced audit of the Grafton County Bank's accounts. Harold Prescott was 61 years old, a veteran of the Confederate Army who had lost his left arm at Antietam and spent the decades since trying to rebuild what the war had destroyed. He had served on the bank's board of directors for 12 years, believing his role was to safeguard his neighbors' savings and ensure the institution's integrity. As he read the telegram by lamplight in his study, his face went pale. He had suspected for months that something wasn't right with the bank's books. Thomas Whitmore had been increasingly evasive at board meetings, deflecting questions about reserves and producing reports that never quite added up. But Prescott had told himself he was being paranoid, that his suspicions were unfounded. Now, with federal examiners set to arrive in less than 2 days, Prescott knew he had to act. He pulled on his coat, called for his carriage, and set out into the October darkness toward the Whitmore mansion. The night was cold and clear, with a quarter moon casting long shadows across the dirt road. Prescott's driver, a freedman named Isaac who had worked for the family since emancipation, urged the horses forward while his employer sat in grim silence, contemplating what he might find when he confronted Thomas Whitmore. Meanwhile, at the mansion, the celebration was in full swing. Samuel Whitmore stood in the dining room, a glass of imported whiskey in his hand, surveying the gathered family members with satisfaction. Thomas and his wife Eleanor occupied chairs at the far end of the long mahogany table, while William and his wife Martha sat to Samuel's right. Catherine and her husband, Sheriff Robert Nash, rounded out the party. Servants moved between the rooms, carrying trays of roasted duck, potato dishes, and fresh bread from the kitchen, where the cook and her staff worked under the watchful eye of the household manager. Thomas had just finished explaining the final details of their land scheme when they heard the sound of a carriage approaching up the gravel drive. Samuel frowned, setting down his glass. They weren't expecting visitors, and anyone who came calling at this hour without invitation was either bringing news or looking for trouble. Sheriff Nash rose from his chair, instinctively reaching for the revolver he wore even at family dinners, but Samuel waved him back down. Whatever this interruption was, it would be handled with the same cold efficiency the Whitmores applied to all their business dealings. The butler opened the front door just as Harold Prescott climbed down from his carriage, his empty left sleeve pinned neatly against his coat. When he demanded to see Thomas Whitmore immediately, the butler hesitated. But Samuel appeared in the entrance hall, his face arranged in an expression of welcoming concern that didn't reach his eyes. Prescott wasted no time with pleasantries. He thrust the telegram at Samuel and demanded that Thomas produce the bank's complete ledgers immediately. Federal examiners were coming, he said, his voice tight with controlled anger, and if there were any irregularities in the accounts, they needed to be addressed before officials arrived. Samuel read the telegram slowly, his expression never changing, but his knuckles whitened as his grip on the paper tightened. Thomas emerged from the dining room, his face flushed from whiskey and celebration. When Samuel handed him the telegram, the younger Whitmore's confident smile vanished. He tried to reassure Prescott that everything was in order, that the bank's books were perfectly balanced and would withstand any scrutiny, but his voice lacked conviction. Prescott wasn't fooled. He had known Thomas since the young man was a child, and he could read the fear behind his eyes. The confrontation escalated quickly. Prescott demanded access to the bank's vault that very night, insisting they conduct their own preliminary review before the federal examiners arrived. Thomas refused, claiming that bank regulations prohibited opening the vault outside normal business hours without proper authorization. But Prescott was not a man easily dismissed. He turned to Sheriff Nash, who had followed the commotion into the entrance hall, and formally requested that law enforcement accompany them to the bank immediately to verify that all funds were properly secured and accounted for. Nash looked uncomfortable, caught between his duty as sheriff and his loyalty to his wife's family. He stammered something about needing proper cause and warrants, but Prescott cut him off. "If the sheriff wouldn't do his duty," Prescott said, raising his voice so the servants could hear, "then he would ride to the next county and bring back a marshal who would." It was at that moment that Samuel Whitmore made the decision that would seal his family's fate and destroy countless lives throughout Grafton County. Samuel Whitmore looked at the faces around him, calculating options with the same ruthless pragmatism he had applied to every challenge in his life. Harold Prescott stood in the entrance hall, his single hand clenched at his side, demanding access to records that would expose the Whitmore family's crimes. Sheriff Nash shifted uncomfortably, clearly unwilling to act against his wife's family, but increasingly aware that his inaction might cost him his badge. Thomas had gone pale, understanding that 16 years of carefully constructed lies were about to collapse, and Samuel knew with absolute certainty that if those federal examiners opened the bank's vault and reviewed the true state of the accounts, the Whitmore family would not just be ruined, but would likely face federal prison. So Samuel made a choice that seemed, in that moment, like the only logical path forward. He smiled at Prescott, placed a hand on the older man's shoulder, and agreed to open the bank immediately. They would review the books together, Samuel said in his most reasonable tone, and put any concerns to rest before the examiners arrived. If there were any discrepancies, they would be minor clerical errors easily explained and corrected. Prescott, suspicious but somewhat mollified by Samuel's apparent cooperation, agreed. The group prepared to ride into Haverford together, with Thomas reluctantly joining them to provide access to the vault. What Prescott didn't know was that Samuel had no intention of allowing those ledgers to be examined. During the 20-minute carriage ride into town, Samuel spoke quietly with Thomas and Sheriff Nash, outlining a desperate plan. The bank's records would show that nearly $80,000 had been embezzled, a staggering sum that represented roughly 40% of the institution's total deposits. There was no way to hide that theft, no creative accounting that could explain such a massive shortfall. But there were other options, Samuel suggested, his voice barely above a whisper, as the horses pulled them through the dark Virginia night. They arrived at the bank just after 8 o'clock. The limestone building stood dark and imposing on the corner of Main Street and Church Avenue, its windows reflecting the lamplight from nearby storefronts. Thomas produced his keys and unlocked the heavy front door, and the group filed into the lobby, their footsteps echoing off marble floors. Prescott carried a kerosene lamp, casting dancing shadows across the teller windows and the brass fixtures that gleamed even in the dim light. While Thomas went to light additional lamps, Samuel moved close to Sheriff Nash, speaking in urgent undertones. What happened next would depend entirely on Nash's willingness to protect his wife's family over his duty to the law and the people of Grafton County. Samuel reminded Nash that Catherine's comfortable life, their 3 children's futures, and Nash's own position all depended on the Whitmore family's continued prosperity. If Thomas went to prison for embezzlement, the scandal would destroy them all. But if they acted decisively tonight, they could control the narrative and protect everyone they loved. Nash listened, his face hardening as he began to understand what Samuel was proposing. He started to shake his head to refuse, but Samuel pressed harder. They were already complicit, he said. Nash had looked the other way for years, had helped enforce Whitmore interests, had accepted gifts and favors that compromised his integrity. He was in too deep to claim innocence now. The only question was whether Nash would go down with the family or help them survive. Harold Prescott called out from across the lobby, asking why everyone was standing around whispering instead of opening the vault. Thomas fumbled with the combination, his hands shaking badly enough that he had to restart the sequence twice. When the heavy door finally swung open, revealing the vault's interior lined with steel deposit boxes and cash drawers, Prescott moved forward with his lamp held high. What happened next would later be disputed by the few survivors, but the essential facts were these. Sheriff Nash drew his revolver. Harold Prescott, hearing the distinctive click of the hammer being cocked, turned just as Nash fired. The bullet struck Prescott in the chest, spinning him around and sending the lamp crashing to the floor. Kerosene spread across the marble, igniting immediately into a wall of flame that raced toward the wooden teller counters. Prescott fell hard, blood spreading across his white shirt, but he wasn't dead yet. He tried to crawl toward the door, leaving a smeared trail across the floor, while Thomas stood frozen in shock, and Samuel rushed to beat out the flames with his coat. Nash fired again, this time hitting Prescott in the back, and the older man went still. The fire was spreading faster than they could control it. The wooden counters had caught, and flames were racing up the walls toward the decorative ceiling tiles. Samuel shouted for water, for anything to stop the blaze, but within minutes it became clear that the bank was lost. They had only seconds to make another decision. Samuel grabbed Thomas by the shoulders, shaking him out of his paralysis, and ordered him to get every piece of paper from the vault. They would burn the evidence, Samuel said, destroy the records that would prove their crimes. In the chaos of a tragic fire, with Bank Director Harold Prescott killed in a terrible accident, no one would ever know the truth about the missing money. But Samuel Whitmore had miscalculated. The fire spreading through the bank would not stay contained to one building on Main Street. And his desperate attempt to destroy evidence would instead trigger a cascade of disasters that would claim lives throughout the county before the sun rose again. The flames reached the second floor of the bank building within 15 minutes, feeding on decades-old timber framing and paper records that burned like tinder. Samuel and Thomas managed to pull armloads of ledgers from the vault before the smoke became too thick to breathe, dragging the evidence of their crimes out the front door and throwing the books into their carriage. Sheriff Nash followed, his revolver still in his hand, his face streaked with soot and twisted with the realization of what he'd just done. Harold Prescott's body remained inside, engulfed now in flames that would make it impossible to determine whether he'd been shot or simply trapped in the fire. But the Whitmores were so focused on destroying evidence and escaping that they failed to notice the wind. October in Virginia could be unpredictable, and that night a steady breeze blew from the southwest, pushing embers from the burning bank across the street toward Morrison's general store. By the time someone spotted the first flames licking at Morrison's wooden shake roof, it was already too late. The store's interior was packed with dry goods, bolts of fabric, lamp oil, and other flammable merchandise. When the fire reached the oil stores in the back room, the explosion blew out the front windows and sent a column of flame shooting 30 feet into the night sky. The sound brought people running from their homes and the nearby tavern. Men formed bucket brigades from the town pump, but the water pressure was inadequate, and the buckets seemed laughably small against the inferno that was rapidly spreading. Women grabbed their children, and whatever possessions they could carry, fleeing into the streets as the fire jumped from building to building. The wind pushed the blaze north along Main Street, igniting the hotel, the feed store, the telegraph office, and the Methodist church with its tall wooden steeple that burned like a torch visible for miles. Samuel and Thomas had driven their carriage 3 blocks away, stopping in an alley behind the courthouse, where they desperately tried to figure out what to do with the incriminating ledgers. They could hear the screams now, the shouts of men fighting the fire, the crack and roar of collapsing buildings. Thomas wanted to help, to go back and join the firefighting efforts, but Samuel grabbed him roughly and told him that if they didn't destroy these records, they would both hang. They built a small fire in the alley, feeding the ledger pages into the flames one by one, watching years of careful embezzlement turn to ash. Meanwhile, the fire had spread to residential streets. The Hendricks family lived in a 2-story house directly behind Morrison's store, and when burning debris landed on their roof, they had less than 5 minutes to escape. James Hendricks, a blacksmith who had worked 16-hour days to build his business, managed to get his wife and 3 youngest children out, but his eldest daughter, 16-year-old Rebecca, had been sleeping in an upstairs bedroom and didn't wake in time. Her screams brought her father rushing back into the burning house, but the stairs had already collapsed. James Hendricks died trying to reach his daughter, both of them consumed by a fire that had started because the Whitmore family valued their freedom more than human life. The volunteer fire brigade from neighboring Ridgeway arrived around 10 o'clock, bringing their horse-drawn steam pump, but by then the fire had engulfed 12 buildings and was threatening to consume the entire downtown. The brigade's chief, a veteran firefighter named Marcus Cole, immediately recognized that they couldn't save the buildings already burning. The only hope was to create a firebreak by demolishing structures in the fire's path. He ordered his men to use explosives to bring down the Masonic Hall and the adjacent dry goods warehouse, hoping to rob the flames of fuel. The strategy might have worked, but the Whitmore family had created another disaster that was only now becoming apparent. At the mill on the eastern edge of town, night shift workers had been processing cotton when sparks from the downtown fire, carried by the wind, landed on bales of raw material stored in the loading yard. The cotton ignited with terrifying speed, and within minutes, the entire mill complex was ablaze. 73 workers were inside the 3-story building when the fire started. The mill's doors had been locked from the outside, a security measure William Whitmore had implemented to prevent workers from leaving early or stealing materials. People trapped inside broke windows and jumped from the 2nd and 3rd floors, preferring broken bones to burning alive. Some made it out with injuries that would heal. Others landed badly and died from internal bleeding or shattered skulls before help could arrive. Still others, overcome by smoke or trapped by collapsing floors, never made it to the windows at all. The mill's boiler, still under pressure from the night's operations, exploded around 11 o'clock, sending shrapnel and burning debris across a quarter-mile radius. The explosion killed 4 firefighters, who had rushed to help evacuate the mill workers, and injured dozens more. By midnight, every able-bodied man in Grafton County was either fighting fires, evacuating families, or transporting the injured to Dr. Hamilton's clinic and the emergency aid station that had been set up in the courthouse. The clinic was overwhelmed within an hour. Dr. Hamilton and his assistant worked frantically to treat burns, broken bones, smoke inhalation, and shock. But they were only 2 people facing dozens of critical patients. Those who couldn't be treated immediately were laid out in the courthouse hallway, waiting their turn, some of them dying before the doctor could reach them. Samuel and Thomas Whitmore watched the devastation from their carriage, the ledgers now reduced to ashes scattered in an alley behind them. They had destroyed the evidence of their embezzlement, but in doing so, they had unleashed a catastrophe that was consuming their entire community. And as the night wore on and the death toll mounted, they began to understand that they had cursed Grafton County far more effectively than any supernatural force ever could. By 3 o'clock in the morning on October 13th, the fires had finally begun to die down, not because they had been successfully fought, but because there was simply nothing left to burn. 21 buildings in downtown Haverford had been reduced to smoking ruins. The textile mill was a collapsed shell of twisted metal and charred timber. The Grafton County Bank, where this nightmare had begun, was nothing but a pile of scorched limestone blocks surrounding a vault that still glowed with residual heat. And scattered throughout the devastation were bodies, some burned beyond recognition, others clearly showing the injuries that had killed them when they jumped from burning buildings or were crushed by collapsing structures. Dr. Hamilton had worked through the night without rest, moving from patient to patient, with blood-stained hands and exhausted eyes. His makeshift hospital in the courthouse held 47 injured people, 12 of whom would not survive until dawn. The doctor had run out of morphine around midnight and had been forced to perform amputations and set broken bones, while patients screamed and had to be held down by volunteers. The smell of burned flesh permeated everything, and Hamilton knew that for the rest of his life he would associate that smell with this terrible night. As the sun rose on October 13th, revealing the full scope of the disaster, survivors began the grim task of searching the ruins for bodies and taking stock of what had been lost. Samuel Whitmore returned to the scene with Thomas and William, making a show of helping with the recovery efforts while internally calculating how to manage the situation. They had successfully destroyed the bank's records, but now they faced a new problem. Without those records, there was no way to know who had deposited what money or who held mortgages on which properties. The bank's collapse meant that hundreds of families would lose their savings, with no proof of what they were owed. Sheriff Nash had disappeared. After shooting Harold Prescott and watching the fire spread, he had apparently ridden out of town sometime around midnight. His wife Catherine was frantic, claiming she had no idea where he had gone, but most people assumed he had fled in shame after failing to control the disaster. No one yet suspected the truth about what had happened inside the bank before the fire started. The telegraph office was among the buildings that had burned, so it took until mid-morning for word of the catastrophe to reach Richmond and other nearby cities. When news finally spread, aid began flowing into Grafton County. The governor dispatched a company of militia to maintain order and help with recovery efforts. Churches from across Virginia organized relief supplies. Neighboring counties sent food, blankets, medical supplies, and volunteers to help rebuild. But nothing could replace what had been lost. By noon on October 13th, the death toll stood at 18, with another dozen people not expected to survive their injuries. Rebecca Hendricks and her father James were among the dead, their bodies recovered from the ruins of their home. 3 members of the Morrison family had died when their store exploded. 7 mill workers had perished in the factory fire, either from the initial blaze or the boiler explosion. And Harold Prescott's charred remains had been found in what was left of the bank, though the severity of the burns made it impossible to determine how he had actually died. The federal banking examiners arrived on the afternoon of October 14th, as scheduled, to find a scene of utter devastation. They picked through the ruins of the bank with Thomas Whitmore, who explained with apparent grief that all the records had been lost in the tragic fire. The examiners were sympathetic, but also suspicious. Bank fires were not uncommon in cases of embezzlement, and the timing of this particular blaze, occurring just hours after the examiners had announced their visit, seemed highly questionable. But without records, without witnesses, and without any physical evidence that hadn't been consumed by flames, there was little the examiners could do. They interviewed depositors who came forward claiming to have lost savings, but none of these people could prove how much money they had actually deposited. The bank's board of directors held an emergency meeting in what remained of the courthouse, and after heated debate, they voted to declare the Grafton County Bank insolvent. Depositors would receive nothing, borrowers' mortgages would be sold to other institutions, and the Whitmore family, despite Thomas's role as bank president, claimed they too were victims of this terrible tragedy. It was Samuel Whitmore's driver, Isaac, who first began to suspect the truth. He had taken Samuel and Thomas to the bank that night and had waited with the carriage while they went inside with Prescott and Sheriff Nash. He had seen them come running out ahead of the flames, had noticed that they went to an alley rather than joining the firefighting efforts, had observed the small fire they built in that alley and the papers they fed into it. Isaac said nothing at first, afraid of what speaking out might cost him, but the knowledge burned inside him like those flames had burned through Haverford. The funeral services began on October 15th and continued for nearly a week. Grafton County had no facility large enough to hold memorial services for so many dead at once, so families buried their loved ones in small ceremonies scattered across the county's various churches and cemeteries. The Hendricks family funeral drew more than 300 mourners who stood in the October cold, listening to the Methodist minister speak about senseless tragedy and God's mysterious ways. James Hendricks had been well liked, and his daughter Rebecca had been preparing to attend a teaching college in Richmond that spring. Now both lay in adjacent graves on a hillside overlooking the valley they had called home. Samuel Whitmore attended every funeral, playing the role of grieving community leader with practiced skill. He donated money from his personal funds to help families who had lost homes, pledged that the mill would be rebuilt and all workers rehired, and spoke movingly about the need for Grafton County to come together in this time of crisis. Many people accepted his gestures at face value, grateful for any help in their devastation. But others watched him with narrowed eyes, wondering why the Whitmore mansion on the hill had been untouched, while so much of the county had burned. The questions about the bank grew louder as more depositors came forward with stories of lost savings. Martha Grayson, a widow who had worked as a seamstress for 30 years, claimed she had deposited nearly $800, her entire life savings, into the Grafton County Bank. Without that money, she would lose her small house and have nothing to support herself in her old age. William Chen, who ran a laundry service in Haverford, said he had kept $300 in the bank, money he had been saving to bring his brother's family over from China. The Patterson family had lost $2,000, their payment for selling a farm they had worked for 2 generations. Thomas Whitmore maintained that without the records, There was no way to verify these claims or distribute any recovered assets fairly. But people began to notice that Thomas seemed to have plenty of personal money available, paying cash for a new house in town to replace office space lost in the fire, purchasing a fine new carriage, and maintaining a lifestyle that seemed inconsistent with someone who had allegedly lost everything in a bank collapse. On October 22nd, Isaac finally worked up the courage to speak to Dr. Hamilton, one of the few men in the county whose integrity was beyond question. He told the doctor what he had witnessed on the night of the fire, about taking Samuel and Thomas to the bank, about the delay before the fire started, about the papers they burned in the alley afterward. Hamilton listened carefully, his face growing progressively darker as Isaac spoke. When the driver finished his account, Hamilton asked him if he would be willing to repeat this story to the federal investigators who were still examining the bank's collapse. Isaac hesitated. He had a wife and 3 children who depended on his employment with the Whitmore family. Speaking out would certainly cost him his job and might cost him much more than that, given the Whitmore's power in the county. But Hamilton placed a hand on Isaac's shoulder and told him that 23 people had died because of what happened that night. If the Whitmores had deliberately set the fire to cover their crimes, they needed to face justice, regardless of the cost to those who exposed them. Word of Isaac's allegations spread quickly through Haverford, carried by whispers in the marketplace and urgent conversations on street corners. The federal investigators requested interviews with Samuel and Thomas Whitmore, who arrived with a lawyer from Richmond and answered questions with carefully rehearsed vagueness. Yes, they had gone to the bank that night with Harold Prescott. Yes, there had been concerns about the upcoming audit. But the fire had been a tragic accident, perhaps started by a lamp knocked over in the chaos of opening the vault. They had fled when the flames became overwhelming, grabbing what records they could save, but ultimately losing everything to the blaze. The investigators asked about Sheriff Nash's whereabouts, and the Whitmores claimed ignorance. Nash had been distraught about his failure to control the fire, they said, and had apparently left town in shame. They suggested searching for him in Richmond or perhaps Charleston, where he had family. What the investigators didn't know was that Nash's body was at that moment lying at the bottom of a ravine 15 miles outside Haverford, put there by William Whitmore after Nash had threatened to confess everything. The sheriff's skull had been crushed by a rock that William claimed Nash had struck when his horse threw him, but the angle of the wound suggested something far more deliberate. The breaking point came on October 28th, when a reporter from the Richmond Times-Dispatch arrived in Grafton County to write a story about the disaster and recovery efforts. The reporter, a sharp-eyed woman named Elizabeth Winters, had covered financial scandals before and immediately recognized the signs of embezzlement and cover-up. She interviewed dozens of people, cross-referenced their accounts, and began to assemble a timeline of events that painted a damning picture of the Whitmore family's actions. When Samuel Whitmore tried to charm her with offers of exclusive interviews and access to the family, Winters smiled politely and asked him pointed questions about why he had visited the bank just hours before it burned, why Sheriff Nash had disappeared so conveniently, and why the fire had started in multiple locations simultaneously. Samuel's composure cracked for just a moment, long enough for Winters to see the calculation behind his eyes. She knew then with certainty that she was looking at a man who had committed terrible crimes and believed he would get away with them. Elizabeth Winters's article appeared on the front page of the Richmond Times-Dispatch on November 3, 1895, under the headline, "Questions Mount Over Grafton County Bank Fire." The story methodically laid out the suspicious circumstances surrounding the disaster, including the convenient timing of the fire just before a federal audit, the destruction of all bank records, the disappearance of Sheriff Nash, and witness accounts placing the Whitmore family at the bank immediately before the blaze started. Winters stopped short of direct accusations, but her implication was clear. The Whitmore family had burned down their own bank to cover financial crimes, and 23 people had died as a result. The article caused a sensation throughout Virginia. Newspapers across the state picked up the story, and public outrage grew as more details emerged. The governor announced that he was ordering a full criminal investigation into the bank's collapse to be conducted by state prosecutors with no local connections. Federal banking officials reopened their examination of the case, this time focusing specifically on potential fraud and arson. And in Grafton County itself, the mood toward the Whitmore family turned from suspicion to open hostility. Someone threw rocks through the windows of the Whitmore mansion on the night of November 5th. The family found a crude effigy hanging from their front gate the following morning, with murderers painted across its chest in red. Workers at the mill began to talk openly about striking unless William Whitmore was removed from his management position. And when Samuel tried to attend church services at the Presbyterian church, where his family had worshipped for 16 years, the minister quietly asked him to leave, saying his presence was causing too much disruption among the congregation. Thomas Whitmore was the first to break under the pressure. On November 12th, after spending the evening drinking whiskey alone in his study, he walked to Dr. Hamilton's house and confessed everything. The embezzlement had started small, he said, just a few $100s here and there to cover personal expenses, but it had grown over the years as he became more confident he wouldn't be caught. By October 1895, he had stolen nearly $80,000 from the bank's deposits, using the money to finance his father's land speculation scheme. When Harold Prescott demanded to see the books, Thomas had panicked. His father had suggested destroying the records, and Sheriff Nash had agreed to help, but Thomas swore he had never meant for anyone to die. The fire was supposed to be contained to the bank building. He had never imagined it would spread through the town and kill so many people. Dr. Hamilton listened to the confession in silence, then told Thomas to wait while he summoned the state investigators who were staying at the hotel. Thomas sat in Hamilton's parlor, his head in his hands, and waited for his world to end. Within an hour, he was under arrest, charged with embezzlement, conspiracy to commit arson, and 23 counts of manslaughter. The investigators immediately went to arrest Samuel Whitmore, but when they arrived at the mansion, they found it empty. Samuel had fled, taking whatever portable valuables he could carry and leaving no indication of where he had gone. William Whitmore was arrested the following day while trying to board a train in Lynchburg. He had panicked when he learned of his brother's confession and attempted to run, but state police had been watching all the major rail stations. When officers searched his belongings, they found Sheriff Nash's badge and personal effects, items William had taken from Nash's body after killing him. Confronted with this evidence, William confessed to murdering the sheriff to prevent him from revealing the truth about Harold Prescott's death. Catherine Whitmore Nash was not charged with any crime, as investigators found no evidence she had known about her family's criminal activities before the fire. But she was left destitute and disgraced, her husband dead, and her brothers facing prison. The Whitmore mansion and all the family's assets were seized by the state to provide restitution to the bank's depositors, though the amounts recovered were far less than what had been lost. The trial began on February 3, 1896, in Richmond, moved from Grafton County because local sentiment made a fair trial impossible. Thomas and William Whitmore sat in the defendant's dock, both looking gaunt and defeated, while prosecutors presented a devastating case built on Thomas's confession, Isaac's eyewitness testimony, and financial records recovered from other institutions that showed the extent of the embezzlement. The defense argued that while the Whitmores had committed financial crimes, they had never intended to cause deaths, and the fire's spread was an unforeseeable accident, for which they bore no moral responsibility. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found both men guilty on all counts. On February 28, 1896, Thomas Whitmore was sentenced to 30 years in the Virginia State Penitentiary. William Whitmore received a sentence of life imprisonment for the murder of Sheriff Nash. Both men were led from the courtroom in chains, while a packed gallery of Grafton County residents watched in grim satisfaction. Samuel Whitmore was never found. Rumors placed him in Mexico, in Canada, in Europe, but despite wanted posters distributed across the country and a substantial reward for information leading to his capture, he vanished completely. Some believed he had died while fleeing, perhaps falling victim to bandits or illness in some remote location. Others thought he had successfully created a new identity and lived out his days in comfortable anonymity, never paying for his crimes. The Grafton County that emerged from the ashes of October 1895 was fundamentally transformed. The fire had destroyed not just buildings, but the community's sense of trust and security. Families who had lost everything in the bank's collapse struggled for years to recover financially. Many never did. Martha Grayson, the seamstress who had lost her life savings, ended up in a county poorhouse, dying there in 1901 at the age of 68. William Chen gave up his dream of bringing his brother's family to America and worked until his death in 1912, never able to save enough money again to feel secure. The Grafton County Bank was never rebuilt. In its place, a bank from Richmond opened a branch office, but many residents refused to use it, keeping their money hidden in their homes rather than trusting another institution with their savings. This lack of banking infrastructure hampered economic development in the county for decades, as businesses struggled to obtain credit and farmers couldn't secure loans for improvements. The vibrant commercial center that Haverford had been before the fire never fully recovered. The textile mill was rebuilt in 1897, but under new ownership after the Whitmore assets were liquidated. The new owners implemented better safety standards, including emergency exits that couldn't be locked from the outside and regular fire drills. A memorial plaque was installed near the entrance listing the names of the 7 workers who had died in the fire, a reminder of the cost of putting profit above human life. For years afterward, the anniversary of the fire was observed as a day of mourning in Grafton County, with services held for those who had perished and renewed commitments to never forget what had happened. The Whitmore mansion stood empty for several years, considered cursed by local residents who refused to buy it even when the price dropped to a fraction of its original value. Children told stories about seeing lights in the windows at night and hearing screams coming from the property, though these were almost certainly just legends born from the trauma of what the Whitmore family had done. Eventually, in 1903, the mansion was purchased by a church group and converted into an orphanage for children who had lost parents in industrial accidents. The conversion seemed fitting, a symbol of something good rising from the ruins of the Whitmore legacy. Dr. Hamilton continued practicing medicine in Grafton County until his death in 1919, never charging fees to families who had lost everything in the fire. He used his influence to push for better building codes, improved fire safety, and stronger banking regulations. Much of Virginia's progressive banking legislation in the early 20th century could be traced back to reforms he championed in the wake of the Grafton County disaster. When he died, the county erected a statue in his honor in front of the rebuilt courthouse, a tribute to a man who had embodied the best of humanity during the community's darkest hours. Elizabeth Winters went on to become one of the most respected investigative journalists in the South, known for her fearless coverage of corruption and her advocacy for victims of financial crimes. She never forgot Grafton County, returning several times over the years to write follow-up stories about the community's recovery and to keep pressure on authorities to continue searching for Samuel Whitmore. In 1920, shortly before her retirement, she established a scholarship fund for students from Grafton County pursuing journalism degrees, wanting to ensure that new generations would continue asking hard questions and holding powerful people accountable. Thomas Whitmore served 14 years of his sentence before dying of pneumonia in the penitentiary in 1910. His last words, according to the prison chaplain, were an apology to the people of Grafton County and a plea for forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. William Whitmore outlived his brother by 3 decades, dying in prison in 1940 at the age of 78. He never expressed remorse for his crimes, maintaining to the end that he had only been protecting his family's interests and that the deaths were tragic accidents beyond anyone's control. The true fate of Samuel Whitmore remained a mystery for 93 years. In 1988, a historian researching early 20th century banking fraud discovered records showing that a man matching Samuel's description had died in Buenos Aires, Argentina in 1923, living under the name Samuel Winston. The man had worked as a financial consultant and had accumulated moderate wealth before succumbing to heart disease. If this was indeed the Samuel Whitmore who had fled Virginia, he had escaped earthly justice for his crimes, living another 28 years in comfortable exile, while the county he destroyed struggled to rebuild. But escape from earthly justice is not the same as escape from consequences. The Whitmore name became synonymous with greed and betrayal throughout Virginia. The family's legacy was not one of wealth and power, but of destruction and disgrace. And Grafton County, though it eventually healed and grew again, never forgot the night when one family's ambition cursed an entire community. In that sense, the Whitmores paid the ultimate price. They would be remembered forever, but only as cautionary tale about what happens when moral bankruptcy combines with unchecked power. Their curse on Grafton County became a curse on themselves, one that would echo through history, long after the last ember of that terrible October fire had finally turned cold. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.